waking one morning to discover that the empire which once made kings tremble is still standing, still crowned in gold and prayer, yet something unseen has shifted beneath its feet. The banners still rise over fortresses, the call to prayer still flows across domes and harbors. The Sultan still sits at the center of a world spanning court, and yet the age has changed its face. The enemy is no longer only at the gate, it is in the map, in the treasury, in the barracks, in the machinery of time itself. This is the Ottoman Empire in the 1700s, not in the instant of collapse, but in that far more haunting moment when a giant first feels the ground move under its shadow. This century mattered because it was the moment when the Ottoman Empire could no longer rely on the old rhythm that had carried it through ages of conquest. For generations, it had ruled like a storm given shape, advancing across continents with discipline, confidence, and a sense of divine destiny. But the 18th century did not ask whether the empire had once been great. It asked whether greatness inherited from the past could survive in a world being remade by new weapons, new economies, and new ways of governing power. That is why the 1700s were a turning point, because the Ottomans were no longer confronting only rivals, they were confronting a new century. To understand the weight of this moment, one must remember what the empire had been. This was no ordinary kingdom stretched across a single plain. It was a civilization of corridors and crossroads, of caravan routes and imperial law, of mosques, markets, ports, and provinces tied together by a state that had learned how to command distance. Istanbul stood like a jeweled hinge between worlds, at once capital, sanctuary, and stage. The Ottoman order had been built not only on force, but on administration, hierarchy, and an extraordinary ability to absorb peoples, territories, and traditions into one imperial frame. Yet by the start of the 18th century, the world beyond that frame had grown sharper, harder, and less forgiving. The first great change was hidden inside the empire's own mechanism. Institutions that had once worked like the gears of a master clock no longer moved with the same certainty. The Timar system had weakened, and provincial administration became more dependent on tax farming and local intermediaries. Power that once flowed more directly from the center now had to pass through hands that possessed their own ambitions. The Janissaries, once the steel nerve of the empire, were no longer only soldiers. Many had become part of urban life, commerce, and political intrigue. None of this meant that the empire had suddenly become weak. It meant something more subtle and perhaps more dangerous. Its strength had become harder to organize, harder to focus, and harder to trust. That internal strain mattered because the outside world was transforming at the same time. Europe in the 18th century was not the same Europe the Ottomans had faced in earlier generations. States were refining taxation, building more durable armies, improving logistics, and turning war into something increasingly methodical. Artillery, officer training, supply systems, and fiscal discipline were being woven together into a new grammar of power. The Ottomans still possessed brave men, experienced commanders, and the immense prestige of an imperial tradition that had shaped centuries. But prestige does not manufacture powder, and memory does not drill a regiment. On the battlefield, the empire was beginning to face opponents whose strength was not only courage, but coordination. This was why conflicts with powers like Austria and Russia felt so consequential. These were not merely wars over frontiers, but encounters with a new balance of force. The shock of earlier setbacks had already shown that the empire could be pushed back, yet the 18th century deepened the lesson. The Ottoman state was still formidable, still capable of resistance, still vast beyond the scale of most rivals, but war was becoming more expensive, more technical, and more dependent on systems that rewarded efficiency over magnificence. The empire had long mastered the art of expansion, Now it was being tested in the harsher art of adjustment, and adjustment is a slower, less glorious discipline. What makes this century so fascinating is that the Ottomans did not simply watch events happen to them. They observed, hesitated, experimented, and began, however unevenly, to respond. The tulip era is often remembered through its elegance, its gardens, its courtly refinement, its fountains and pleasures, yet to see only ornament, there is to miss the deeper pulse of the age. Beneath the silk and ceremony was a state beginning to study change itself. Diplomatic curiosity widened, contacts with Europe grew more attentive. New tastes in architecture and culture appeared, but so did new questions about technology, administration, and military knowledge. Even where reform seemed fragile or incomplete, it revealed something important. The empire had begun to understand that survival might require learning from the very world it once sought mainly to dominate. That recognition was the true pivot. The Ottoman Empire in the 1700s was not simply declining in a straight line, as though history were some neat and pitiless staircase downward. It was wrestling with transformation. Old formulas still carried authority, but no longer offered enough certainty. The center had to negotiate more carefully with provincial notables. Revenue had to be extracted in a changing economic environment. Diplomacy had to become more continuous, informed, and deliberate. Military renewal was no longer a matter of prestige, but of necessity. The empire was discovering that preservation itself could demand innovation, and that is one of the most difficult realizations any great power can face. The consequences of this were felt far beyond palace walls. In the provinces, local elites rose in importance, sometimes stabilizing imperial rule, sometimes narrowing it to their own interests. In the cities, ordinary life continued beneath the grandeur of imperial symbols, but the nature of authority was becoming more layered. The Ottoman world still possessed immense continuity. Courts functioned, trade moved, prayers were spoken, ships crossed the waters, decrees were issued under the sovereign's name. Yet continuity was no longer the same thing as confidence. The empire could still command reverence, but reverence was now sharing space with improvisation. That tension gave the century its unique drama, and still, for all these pressures, the Ottoman Empire did not vanish into silence. That is the mistake made by those who read the century too quickly. They see setbacks and assume exhaustion. They see reform and assume panic. But empires do not live or die only by the measure of their wounds. They also reveal themselves in how they absorb shock. The Ottomans remained a major power, not because nothing had changed, but because so much had changed and they continued to endure. Their endurance was imperfect, uneven, and at times painfully slow, yet it was real. There is something profoundly human in that, the refusal of an old order to surrender, even as it is forced to re-examine every habit that once made it strong. By the later decades of the 18th century, the message was unmistakable. Russia was becoming a more dangerous rival, especially around the Black Sea. European powers were developing stronger administrative and military systems. Ottoman reform could no longer be occasional or cosmetic. It had to become more urgent, more deliberate, more self-aware. The empire that had entered the century leaning on inheritance was leaving it with a harsher understanding. Memory alone could not secure the future. The road toward later reforms, toward deeper restructuring, toward more dramatic efforts to rebuild imperial strength, was being opened in these very years. The turning point was not one event, but a long awakening. So the Ottoman Empire in the 1700s should be remembered not as a relic dimming at the edge of history, but as a vast and living power caught in the difficult act of translating itself into a new age. Its domes still gleamed, its archives still whispered, its soldiers still marched beneath ancient emblems, but the terms of survival had changed. This was the century when grandeur met resistance, when custom met calculation, when an empire born in expansion was forced to study endurance. In that struggle, the Ottoman world became more exposed, more complex, and in many ways more revealing than ever before. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. Not the sound of an empire falling, but the sound of an empire realizing that the future would no longer bow so easily. And sometimes, in history, that realization is more dramatic than defeat itself. It is the moment when ceremony can no longer hide urgency, when habit can no longer silence necessity, when the past stops being a throne and becomes a burden that must be carried with wisdom. That was the Ottoman turning point of the 18th century, a moment carved not only by battles and treaties, but by awareness. And that is why this story still matters today, because it reminds us that the most important turning points are rarely announced by a single thunderclap. Often they arrive slowly, like winter entering a palace through unseen cracks, until even the mightiest walls begin to feel the cold. The Ottomans did not meet that cold with immediate collapse. They met it with hesitation, resilience, adaptation, and pride. They met it as only an old empire can, with dignity under pressure. History changed there, and the empire heard it breathe.